You filed the rikon totoke on a Tuesday morning because Tuesday felt like the least dramatic day of the week to end a marriage. You'd spent 2 weeks choosing the day. Monday felt like a statement. Friday felt like you were celebrating. Tuesday was administrative, bureaucratic. The kind of day where you handle paperwork and move on, which is what you told yourself this was going to be. Paperwork. Your wife ran a consulting firm out of an office in Shinjuku with frosted glass doors and a receptionist who never made eye contact with you. She had business cards that listed 3 different titles. She wore tailored suits to dinner and knew every maitre d' in the district by name and paid for everything in cash because she said cards were inconvenient, which you believed, because you wanted to believe it, because the alternative required a conversation you weren't ready to have. The tattoos you thought were aesthetic, a sleeve that ran from her left shoulder to her wrist, koi and chrysanthemums rendered in that particular style that should have told you something if you'd been paying attention. You weren't paying attention. You were in love, which is the most expensive thing a person can be. The rikon totoke requires 2 witnesses. She provided both of them. 2 men in dark jackets who arrived at the ward office already knowing where the parking was, already knowing where to stand, already holding pens. They signed where they were supposed to sign without reading anything, which you registered as efficient rather than rehearsed. One of them had a tattoo visible above his collar. You noticed it the way you notice weather, acknowledged it and moved on. The ward office clerk was a small man in his 50s who processed divorce paperwork the way most people process mail, until he looked at your wife's witnesses. Then he processed the rest of the paperwork the way a man processes paperwork when he would very much like to be somewhere else. His hands were steady. His face was doing something complicated. He asked twice if everything was in order, both times looking at you specifically, which you interpreted as professional diligence and which was almost certainly something else. Your wife stood beside you the entire time in a gray jacket, calm the way deep water is calm, which is to say there is no actual stillness there, only the appearance of it from the surface. She said nothing while you explained to the clerk why you were there. She said nothing while he reviewed the form. She said nothing and she was the most present person in the room. She signed the form without reading it, capped the pen, handed it back to the clerk, and smiled at you in a way that made the clerk find somewhere else to look. Under Japanese law, anything acquired during a marriage is shared property, which sounds straightforward, until you're sitting in a conference room trying to figure out what to do with assets that technically don't exist. The apartment in Shinjuku is real. The car registered in her name is real. The savings accounts you were never given access to are presumably real, though the balances you were shown don't match the lifestyle you watched her maintain for 4 years without apparent effort. Her lawyer arrived with a document that ran 47 pages, which is 47 pages more than your lawyer was prepared for. Your lawyer handles small business disputes in Saitama. He's a good man who charges reasonable rates and answers his phone. He went very quiet reading page 1, and he stayed quiet for a long time after that, in the way people go quiet when they're deciding how much they actually want to know. The problem with dividing marital assets when half of them don't officially exist is that you can't argue about things that aren't there. You can't point at a number that isn't written down. You can't dispute the valuation of a property that isn't on any deed you've ever seen. Her lawyer referred to certain financial instruments as organizational contributions, said it in the same tone someone might use to describe a gym membership, and moved on before you could formulate a follow-up question, which was probably the point. Your lawyer wrote the phrase down on his legal pad and then looked at it for a while like he was hoping it would explain itself. She offered you the apartment. She offered you a settlement figure that was, on paper, genuinely reasonable. More than reasonable, more than you were planning to ask for, more than your lawyer had quietly suggested you'd get. It came with a clause. The clause ran 4 pages on its own. You were not allowed to discuss the clause, which is something you didn't know was a legally enforceable condition until that afternoon, and something you're still not entirely sure is legal, but your lawyer didn't raise an objection, and at that point you'd stopped expecting him to. The word generous kept appearing in your head in a way that felt less like reassurance and more like a warning label. You signed the preliminary agreement because her lawyer was watching you, with the particular patience of someone who has sat in a lot of conference rooms and has never once been on the losing side of one. You took your copy of the 47-page document home in a manila envelope and put it on your kitchen table and made yourself a drink and looked at it for 20 minutes without opening it. Your lawyer drove home in silence and called you the next morning to say he was referring you to someone else, someone with more relevant experience, and you didn't ask what kind of experience that meant. You met maybe 30 of them over the course of the marriage and thought they were cousins, business associates, guys from her hometown who owed her favors. There was the quiet man named Hiroshi who helped you move apartments and never once accepted payment, which you thought was generosity. There was the older guy who showed up at the hospital when you had your appendix out and sat in the waiting room for 4 hours without being asked, which you thought was loyalty. You thought a lot of things that turned out to be technically accurate but functionally wrong. The Yakuza organization does not work the way most people imagine it works. It is not a business that happens to use violence. It is a family that happens to be structured like a corporation. Byoyabun sits at the center of it, the way a father sits at the head of a table, not because he's the most qualified, but because the whole structure only functions if everyone in it agrees it does. His Kobun are his sons, effectively. They call each other by family terms. They cut their ties to their actual relatives when they enter. You are not supposed to understand this from the outside, and you didn't. She introduced you to her Oyabun once at a dinner in Ginza, and she said, "This is my husband." And he looked at you the way people look at furniture they didn't choose but are willing to tolerate. He nodded once. You nodded back. You thought it was a cultural thing. What you understand now is that in her world, you occupied a specific category that had nothing to do with love or partnership. You were the civilian husband, which is its own kind of role, with its own kind of boundaries. And one of those boundaries was that you were not leaving. Divorce is a concept that belongs to the world outside. Inside the family structure she belongs to, the bonds are sealed differently and dissolved by different processes, none of which involve a form submitted to a ward office clerk. After you filed, they didn't come to your apartment. They didn't call you. Nobody sat across from you in a room and explained the situation, because explaining would mean acknowledging there was a situation to explain. Instead, Hiroshi was in the parking garage when you left work on Monday. A different man you recognized from her New Year's party was on the platform when you took the train home Thursday. They weren't watching you the way security watches a threat. They were watching you the way a family watches someone who doesn't yet understand what family means. When you mentioned to her once that you'd seen the same man outside your office 3 days in a row, she said, "That's Kenji, he worries," and changed the subject. At some point around week 2 of the divorce proceedings, you started researching, the way people do when they realize they don't actually understand the situation they're in. You told yourself it was practical, that knowing the context would help you navigate the settlement, that information was a form of control, and you were a person who valued control. And all of that was a very reasonable set of lies to tell yourself at 2 in the morning, with your laptop open on the kitchen table and your phone face down so you wouldn't see if she called. What you found was that the history of women in the Yakuza is longer and stranger and considerably more violent than anything you were prepared to read about a person whose dry cleaning you used to pick up on Thursdays. In the Edo period, when the Yakuza's ancestors were primarily gamblers moving through post towns and backroad markets, women ran gambling houses alongside men, placed their own bets, and led their own crews. That was the beginning of something. After the war, in Yokohama and Tokyo, female oyabun were documented in the post-war chaos running their own operations with the same authority as any male boss in the same territory, and more than one of them participated in the full Sakazuki ceremony, which you didn't know about yet but were about to read approximately 17 articles on in quick succession. In the early 1980s, when the third boss of the Yamaguchi Gumi died, his widow Fumiko took control of the largest Yakuza syndicate in Japan, briefly, but she took it. Then there was Mako Nishimura, who is the only woman the National Police Agency has ever officially recognized as a full Yakuza member, and whose story you read in a way that made you set your coffee down and not pick it back up. She was 20 years old when she stepped into a bar fight to defend her lover, and beat a rival gang member badly enough that rumors about her reached an oyabun who asked to meet her and then offered her a position on the spot, because apparently that is something that can happen. She spent years doing debt collection, running businesses, mediating disputes between rival groups, and eventually she performed yubisume, which is the ritual of cutting off your own fingertip as penance for a collective failure. And she did it with enough composure that other members started asking her to do theirs. They called her the master of finger cutting. The National Police Agency put that in official records. That is a government document. You closed the laptop around 3:15 and sat there for a while thinking about how you described her to your mother as driven, focused, someone who ran a tight operation and didn't tolerate disorder. 3 days after filing, you'd gone through her dresser looking for the lease agreement on the Shinjuku apartment and found, under 2 folded scarves and a travel jewelry case, a tanto knife wrapped in a square of dark silk. The edge clean and the wrapping tight, the way something is wrapped when it is regularly unwrapped and checked and rewrapped. You put the knife back exactly as you found it, refolded the silk, closed the drawer, and decided you didn't need to know anything else about her past. The sake ceremony that initiates a Yakuza member into their clan is nearly identical, structurally, to a traditional Japanese wedding ceremony, which feels like a joke until you think about it too long. The oyabun pours. The new member drinks. They exchange cups, drink from each other's, and that's it. You're family now. The permanent kind. The kind that doesn't dissolve in a ward office on a Tuesday morning with 2 witnesses and a clerk who won't make eye contact. The same ritual that seals a marriage seals a Yakuza bond, which means the ceremony you had at that small shrine in Kyoto with 30 guests and rented suits was in the hierarchy of things that bound her to other people, not first, not even close. She went through the Sakazuki before she ever met you, before the shrine, before the first date, before whatever version of herself she showed you when you were still someone she was deciding about. By the time you were her husband, she was already someone else's Kobun, already part of a family structure that predates you and outranks you, and does not, it turns out, recognize divorce as a concept worth taking seriously. You were marrying into something that had already claimed her. You just didn't know it, because you didn't ask, and you didn't ask because you didn't want to know, which is its own kind of answer. Her left hand, the tip of her ring finger, gone just below the first joint, smooth and old. She told you it was a kitchen knife accident when she was 9, that her mother had panicked, that the scar had faded over the years. You believed her because she said it easily, the way people say things that are true. You believed her because the alternative was a word you didn't want to attach to the woman you were sleeping next to. You believed her because wanting something to be ordinary is, apparently, a very effective way of making it seem that way, right up until it isn't. Weeks into the divorce proceedings, on a night when neither of you was pretending the conversation was about anything other than what it was actually about, you asked her directly. You looked at her hand, and you asked. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at you the way someone looks at a question they've been waiting a long time to hear, patient and a little tired. And then she was quiet for long enough that the apartment felt smaller than it had before. Then she said it. She told you she appreciated that you'd never asked, and the way she said it made you feel, briefly, like you'd done something right in a situation where everything you did was wrong. 6 weeks after you filed the paperwork, your parents called to say their car had a flat tire in their own driveway. That is not a threat, which is not anything, which is just a flat tire. Tires go flat. It happens to people all the time, to people who have never met anyone connected to organized crime, to people who live ordinary lives in ordinary suburbs and whose biggest problem is a leaky faucet or a neighbor who doesn't sort their recycling properly. Your sister's landlord decided not to renew her lease around the same time, citing plans to renovate the building. That is a completely normal thing for landlords to do and has nothing to do with you or your wife or the 47-page settlement document currently sitting in a drawer in your apartment. Your best friend got audited by the tax authority, which statistically happens to someone every year. That someone is occasionally a graphic designer in Osaka who has never done anything more financially suspicious than writing off his laptop as a business expense. None of this is connected. You are connecting it because you are stressed and not sleeping well, and your brain is doing the thing brains do when they are looking for patterns in a situation they don't have a framework for. That's what you tell yourself on day 1. By day 4, you've stopped telling yourself anything and started looking up the price of flights to countries that don't have extradition agreements with Japan. That turns out to be a surprisingly short list when you actually research it. Also completely useless information because you have a job here, and aging parents here. A sister whose landlord has apparently decided to renovate an entirely functional building for no particular reason. She called on a Wednesday evening the way she always calls, that is calmly, with the kind of composure that used to seem like emotional maturity and now seems like something else entirely. She said she'd been reconsidering the settlement terms and wanted to talk through some revisions. You asked what specifically. She said she'd like the divorce withdrawn, not paused, not amended, withdrawn, as if it were a strongly worded email and not a legal filing that you had spent 8 weeks and a substantial amount of money putting together. You asked what happens if you don't withdraw it. There was a pause that lasted maybe 4 seconds. That is a long time for a pause when you are waiting for the answer to that particular question. She said she thought you should get some sleep because you sounded tired. Then she wished you a good evening and hung up. You sat there holding your phone in a kitchen that was technically still half hers and realized that the most frightening thing anyone had ever said to you was a suggestion about your sleep hygiene. Your new lawyer stopped returning calls on day 3. When you went to his office, his assistant said he was traveling indefinitely and couldn't confirm when he'd be back. You withdrew the filing on a Friday, and she thanked you over dinner at the same restaurant where you had your first date. And she ordered the sea bream because she remembered it was your favorite, and nothing about her face was wrong. That's the part you keep returning to, even now, even knowing everything you know, which is that she was genuinely pleased, not performing pleasure, not managing you the way her Kobun managed parking lots and lease renewals and tire pressure, but actually satisfied, the way someone is satisfied when a thing they built comes back to them intact. She poured your sake herself. She asked about your sister's new apartment, the one she'd just found after the lease situation resolved itself, and she listened to your answer with what appeared to be real interest. The restaurant was quiet. You thought, briefly, that maybe the worst was behind you. The next 3 weeks were normal in the way that a room is normal right after someone has cleaned it very carefully. Your parents called more than usual. Your best friend's audit wrapped up without findings? You went back to work and your commute was your commute, and Kenji was not in the parking lot anymore. Or if he was, you stopped noticing him, which amounts to the same thing. She came home at reasonable hours. She didn't mention the settlement, didn't mention the 47 pages, didn't reference any of the organizational contributions, or the clause you were not allowed to discuss. You told yourself that you had misread the situation, that you had frightened yourself with research in 2M laptop screens and a tanto knife that was probably not even hers. You ordered the same thing twice for dinner from the same delivery place and felt, for the first time in months, like a person with an ordinary life. She suggested the family dinner on a Thursday. Her idea? Her planning? She would cook herself, which she had never done for your family before, had never offered to do, and you noted this without understanding it the way you notice sound in a wall, without knowing what's making it. She wanted your parents, your sister. She asked you to confirm everyone was free by the weekend, and you confirmed it because what reason did you have to say no? The meal took her most of Saturday to prepare. The kitchen smelled like something slow-cooked and careful. Her Kobun were outside, which was not unusual, which had never been unusual, which you had explained to yourself as security and habit and the general way people like her moved through the world. At the table, she gave a toast. She raised her glass and talked about a proverb, the kind that sounds like something stitched on a pillow until you consider the specific occasion on which someone has chosen to say it. Something about loyalty being the root that holds the tree when the storm arrives. Your mother said it was beautiful. Your father nodded. Your sister asked how to say it in Japanese, and she repeated it slowly, patient, almost warm. You watched her face while she said it, and you still couldn't find anything wrong there, which is its own kind of answer, which is actually the final answer, which you understood somewhere below the level of language a moment too late. The last thing you thought, before you stopped thinking about anything at all, was that some doors are not made for opening, and some families are not made for leaving, are not made for leaving, are not made